The next function we're going to learn about that is also a very handy function is the SumIf and then the SumIfs function. The SumIf and the SumIfs is just an extension of the sum function. So we've used the sum function in class so far, and the sum function just basically adds everything up. Well, the SumIf will add everything up if it meets a certain criteria. So let's kind of see how all that looks. So we have a scenario here where we had, say, a livestock auction, and we had 3 different species. We had sheep, then all of a sudden we transitioned into swine, and then we had a cattle species being sold at the end. We have all of the seller numbers in this column, the buyer numbers in this column, and then the amount that they sold for over here. So what if we want to add up just the total money spent on sheep and not really add up anything else? So what we're going to do is we're going to sum all of that money spent and bring in that condition of just the money spent on sheep. So let's look up what it would look like. So we type in SumIf. So our SumIf is we are going to highlight our range first and foremost, and the range is the range at which it's tested against the criteria. So our range, what we're going to be testing is to see this row right here, or this column, to see if any of them equal sheep. Now, we want to add up this column, so the sum range is this column over here, because we're adding up how much we spent on sheep. So right here it says that we have spent $14,200 was spent on sheep. Let's do a quick little check here. This is all the amount that was spent on sheep. So if we do an equals sum and highlight all the way down to the end of the sheep in this particular cell, we see that it comes out with 14,200, which is exactly the number that we got up here. So let's do that again. Let's go through it a little bit slower this time and bring up another SumIf. Only this time we want to add up all of the money that was spent on swine. So we are going to say equals SumIf. Our range, what we are going to be checking, so the range is what's to check against the criteria. So we want to highlight that column that we are going to be checking against that criteria. Right now we are looking to see if it's equal to swine. So this is our criteria range. So we highlight all of our criteria range, comma. Our criteria is we're just going to type it in text now. And before we said equals sheep, now we're going to do equals swine. We also have to add up a sum range. That sum range is the range in which to be summed if it is different from the range. So what we're going to do, because this is not numbers, it's not a numerical value, and we're adding this up, this is our sum range because we're adding up all of this value over here. And we see that $13,600 was spent on swine. Now let's go through the same process of how much was spent on cattle. So we're going to do equals SumIf. Again, our range is this area that we're going to be testing against that criterion. Our criterion is open quotations equals cattle. Next comma, and then our sum range. And our sum range is the value that we are going to add up, which is this one way over here. We press enter. Now we can see that out of the 3 different species, so this is a quick little check, we can add these formulas in, say, the top of our sheets to where now we can figure out really a quick reference of how much everybody spent on what species. So now we know that we spent $14,000 on sheep, $13,000 on swine, and $36,500 on cattle. So we know that the cattle are the big sellers, which makes sense because they're the large animals, followed by sheep and then swine. So next we're going to figure out what if we're going to add up the total amount of money spent by buyer number 216. Here we're going to do another SumIf. Only this time we are going to figure out how much money buyer number 216 spent. So we're going to, out of all of these numbers out here, we're just going to pull out the ones and add up the ones that are equal to 216. And instead of having to search for each one and then write down the corresponding number, we're going to have the computer do it for us. So we're checking this column to see if any of them are equal to 216. And if they are equal to 216, we want them to add up the values corresponding with that number out of this column, that sum if range. So if we close parentheses, we press enter, we see that buyer number 216 spent $2,150 in this sale. And what I'd like for you to do is take a second and actually search through it all. And maybe even bold those ones that are 216. So there's a 216, there's a 216. And if we look all the way down, there's another 216. So if we say, all right, we have 260 down here, 700 and 800. So if we say equals 650 plus 700 plus 800, we see that we get 2,150, which is the exact number that we're getting right there. So this sum if will add up everything based on a criterion. But what if we want to have more than one criterion? What if we want to say how much did buyer number 216 spend, but just on sheep? Well, for adding multiple criterion, it's where we begin to use that nice little cousin or the brother of sum if, or maybe the sister of sum if. We call it sum ifs. So the sum ifs is going to be a little bit different. The very first thing you highlight is now the sum range, which is going to be this column over here. Remember, that was the last one we highlighted before in the sum if. Well, now it becomes the first one in the sum ifs. Our first criteria, we want to figure out how much buyer number 216 spent. So we're going to highlight this column, and we're going to say 216, because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for buyer number 216. And as you can see right here, it kind of shows up an estimated amount right now, or that the answer that it would yield right now, which is still the same as the one above, because so far all we're doing is adding up how much buyer number 216 is spent. Our criteria range 2 is how much of that was purchased of sheep. How much of that $2,150 did he buy sheep with? So we're going to highlight the species because that's our next criterion. We are going to say that that is equal to sheep. Press enter. Now we see that's equal to 1,500, which if we look, that's how much they spent between 800 and 700 across those two sheep. Now if you'll notice something, as I'm going through here, whenever I'm typing in, for example, like this 216, if we go up here, I said equals sheep, equals swine, equals cattle. But as we get down here, I start typing in something like 216 and not equals 216, nor am I typing that in quotations now. But I could if I wanted to. I could say open quotations equals 216. It would still yield me the same answer. Or I could just type in quotations 216. Still would yield me the same answer. What it's doing is there's multiple ways to type this in sometimes. Like you can type in the equals 216 or in quotation. You can type in just 216 or you could type in 216 in quotation. Here I even capitalized the P when I shouldn't have, and it still read it right. So what this computer tries to do is it tries to take a lot of your little mistakes, such as typing in equals in the wrong place and get rid of them. But if I were to come in here and type in just sheep, it would no longer work. And the reason for that is because that sheep is text. Anytime you're typing in text, it always needs to be in a quotations, just like that for it to work. Well, so let's do another sum ifs example. So we have another sum ifs. Remember, the first thing we need to do in our sum ifs is highlight our sum range, which is our sale price, because we're going to be looking for the total amount of money spent on swine by buyer numbers greater than 225. So there is our sum range. Our first criterion range is we're looking for how much money was spent on swine. So we highlight all of that. We are going to say that it has to be equal to swine. Our second criteria, the next thing we want to know is how much was spent on swine by buyer numbers greater than 225, for example. So we have buyer numbers. We go down, and in this, our criterion is going to be open parenthesis greater than 225. Now, whenever you're doing these greater than or less than, those do need to have the symbol of greater than or less than, and they do need to be in quotation. If we take it out of quotation, it doesn't work. We can see that it's going to throw off an error. So we do need to throw our greater than or less than into an equation because of the way that the computer will read it. So we can actually see that out of that 3,600, only 1,475 was bought by buyer numbers greater than 225. Now, what if you want to pull out how much money that sellers earned by, or how much money was earned by seller number 135 on cattle that brought more than 2,500? Maybe we're looking at how much money he earned on his higher end cattle, and we say the break in it is that those cattle that are more expensive than 2,500 are the higher end cattle. So now we can do another sum ifs because we have different conditions. So we're going to do some, if I could type it right, sum ifs. Our sum range is still right here. It's been our sum range this whole time because all we're really concerned about is how much money these people are making. Our first criterion is we want to know the buyer number, how much the seller number brought. Seller number 135. So we're going to highlight all of this. We have seller number 135. Now our next criterion is it says we want to know how much they brought on cattle. So we have to isolate just the cattle. So we're going to highlight all of this column to separate just the cattle. We're going to make that equal to cattle. And then, but we're still not done. Here is a sum ifs with multiple criterion, all the way out to 3 criterion. In the sum ifs, you can add as many criterion as you really need. So in this case, we also want to know how much they brought on cattle that brought greater than 2 or 2,500. So we're going to sort it out by this too, or we're going to use that as our criterion. Or we're going to say that that has to be greater than $2,500. So we press enter. And now we have this long equation with 3 different criterion, and we can see that out of that 3 different criterion, we have the total amount that was earned by seller 135 on cattle that brought more than 2,500 was this 5,725.